My son shook my hand at the closing table. Not a hug, a handshake. Firm, brief, the kind you give a vendor you've just paid off. He looked me in the eye when he did it, which I'll give him credit for. Then he turned back to the stack of documents in front of him and signed his name, not mine, on the final transfer agreement for Callaway Ridge Timber and Land Company, the company I had built from 40 acres and a second mortgage in 1987. I was 63 years old, sitting in the leather chair that used to be mine, in an office that used to be mine, watching my son become the owner of something I had never planned to give away. Not like this. Not yet. And certainly not in front of the attorneys, the accountant, and my daughter-in-law, who sat to his left with a yellow legal pad and did not look up once. I didn't say anything. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out a pen, and signed where they told me to sign. Then I picked up my coffee cup, the old one, the chipped blue one that had sat on my desk for 20 years, and I walked out. My son had been asking about succession for 3 years. I understood that he was 41. He'd worked in the company since he was 19, started on a log crew, moved into operations, learned the land side for me personally. I was proud of him. That part was never in question. What was in question was the pace. And who was doing the asking? The summer before the closing, his wife had started attending business meetings. She hadn't worked a day in timber. She had a background in event planning, which is a fine profession, but it is not the same as understanding watershed easements and timber rights, and the relationship between a mill contract and a 30-year growing cycle. She sat in those meetings with her legal pad and asked questions that sounded reasonable on the surface and weren't. She started using the phrase, legacy extraction, in conversations. I had to look it up the first time I heard it. It means liquidating what someone built before it deteriorates. It means cashing out. I was not deteriorating. I was 63. My son had always been a good man. What happened wasn't malice. It was pressure from a direction I hadn't anticipated, applied slowly, over time, until the path of least resistance was just signing the papers. The first indication came in April, not from my son, but from you, our family attorney. He called me on a Tuesday morning and asked if I'd been in contact with a firm called Harmon Bridgewater out of Charlotte. I hadn't. Hugh told me they'd reached out to his office with preliminary questions about the company's articles of incorporation, specifically about transfer procedures and founder override clauses. Someone had made an inquiry, without telling me. I called my son. He said his wife had just been doing research, getting informed. He said I was overreacting. I am a man who spent 35 years reading weather patterns, soil reports, and contract language. I do not overreact to data. That evening I drove out to the back section of the property, the part we never harvested, 40 acres of second-growth hardwood that backed up against a creek nobody had bothered to name. I'd built a bench out there years ago. My wife used to walk out there with me on Sunday mornings before she passed. I sat on that bench for a long time. I wasn't angry yet. I was thinking. The next morning, I called a man named Holt. I'd known Holt Dempsey for 25 years. He ran a land trust and resource consulting group out of Asheville that did work nobody talked about at dinner parties, estate restructuring, asset protection, long-view timber holding strategies. The kind of work you do when you're not sure who in your family is watching your flank. I'd sent him 2 clients over the years. He owed me a conversation. We met for lunch. I told him what I'd found out. He listened without interrupting, which is how I know a man is taking you seriously. When I finished, he set down his fork and said, "You own the land. What do you own the company?" 60%. My son held 30. The remaining 10 had gone to a key employer arrangement years back, 2 men who had been with me since the early days. Holt asked me if I'd ever considered restructuring the land holdings separately from the operational company. I told him I hadn't needed to. He said I might want to think about needing to. I don't want to oversimplify what happened over the next several months because it wasn't simple. It involved attorneys, a CPA I'd used for 15 years, and more than a few late nights with maps and legal descriptions spread across my dining room table. But the short version is this: the timber rights, the mineral interests, and the conservation easements on the core acreage, The parts that produced most of the long-term value were held through a separate entity I restructured in my name, Ridge Reserve LLC. The operating company, Callaway Ridge Timber, held the equipment, the contracts, the employees, and the brand. But the land was mine. It had always been mine. I just made sure the paperwork said so clearly. My son didn't notice. He was focused on the operating company. His wife was focused on the operating company. The Harmon Bridgewater attorneys were focused on the operating company. Nobody asked about the land trust. I didn't hide it. It was filed. It was legal. It was simply not the thing they were paying attention to. By October, the pressure to sign had become steady. Family dinners were uncomfortable. My son had stopped calling about anything other than the transition. His wife sent me a document once, a transition timeline. It had dates on it. My retirement was listed as a line item. I was 63 years old with good knees and a sound mind and 40 years of contacts in the Southeast timber and land market. My retirement was not a line item. I signed the operating company over in November. I shook my son's hand. I took my coffee cup. I walked out. I drove back to the property. The trees were bare by then, just the shape of them against a gray sky, which I have always found more honest than the way they look in summer when everything is trying to look better than it is. I sat on the bench by the creek for a while. The following Monday, I drove to Asheville and met with Holt again. He had 3 introductions waiting for me. A timber investment group out of Knoxville that had been looking for a management partner on a 40,000-acre acquisition, a conservation land trust that needed someone to oversee a long-term stewardship contract in the Western Carolinas, and a family in Virginia that was trying to figure out what to do with 800 acres of inherited hardwood before the estate tax situation got worse. Holt slid the folders across the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You're not retired." I said, "No, I'm just unencumbered." I started Ridge Reserve Consulting in December. No employees at first, just me and a desk, and the same laptop I'd used for the last 4 years. I didn't have a website. I didn't need one. In 35 years of this business, I had never once gotten a contract from a website. The Knoxville group called on a Wednesday. They'd heard about me through a contact at a forestry conference I'd spoken at in 2019. They wanted to know if I was available to advise on a long-term management structure for the acquisition. The acreage was in 3 counties, mixed hardwood and pine. Some of it in a watershed protection zone which requires specific handling most consultants get wrong. I told them I was available. They asked who I was with now. I said Ridge Reserve. There was a pause. Then the man on the phone said, "Is that new?" "Brand new," I said. "And before that?" "Callaway Ridge. I founded it." Another pause, shorter. "I've heard of Callaway Ridge. Good operation." "It is," I said. "My son runs it now." The contract came through the following week. 7 figures over 5 years, structured around annual management plans and harvest cycle recommendations. The kind of work I could do with 35 years of pattern recognition and a set of county plat maps. I did not feel triumphant. I felt useful, which is different and better. In January, my son called. He had been trying to get in touch with the family in Virginia about a potential timber acquisition of his own and had given them my name as a reference. They had mentioned, almost as an aside, that they were already working with me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know you were consulting." I said, "I've been in this business since before you were born." "What did you think I was going to do?" He didn't answer that. He asked why I hadn't told him. I said I didn't think it was relevant to his operation. He said it felt like I was competing with him. I said I was doing the same work I'd always done for clients who sought me out. If that created overlap, that was the nature of the business. The real issue surfaced about a week later. He had been in conversation with a land broker about a parcel adjacent to the main Callaway Ridge property, 60 acres that would have given them road access to a back section they'd never been able to reach economically. The broker told my son that the parcel had already sold. It had sold to Ridge Reserve LLC. I bought it because it was good land at a fair price and because I had been watching that parcel for 11 years. I knew the seller. We had spoken about it twice in the last decade. When he was ready to sell, he called me. My son called me 40 minutes after he found out. He said that was our land. I said it was available land. I bought it. He said his wife was furious. I said that was between the two of them. He said I was trying to undermine him. I told him I had structured my affairs properly and worked my relationships honestly. What I had not done was consult him before making a business decision about a parcel he didn't own and hadn't contracted on. There was a long pause. He said, "You planned this." I said, "I planned not to be without options." What came next was not a legal dispute. My son is not a bad man, and his attorney apparently told him there was nothing actionable. What came next was 3 months of difficult silence, Sunday dinners with too many short sentences, and a persistent feeling that we were living in the aftermath of something that hadn't finished settling. His wife stopped attending family events for a while. I noticed, but I didn't comment. In March, Holt called me about a situation in Tennessee. A fourth-generation timber family with 2 adult children who couldn't agree on anything had brought in a mediator to help restructure how the operation was governed. They needed an outside advisor who understood both the land side and the family dynamics. Holt thought of me. I drove up to Cookeville on a Wednesday and sat in a room with 2 siblings who had not spoken directly to each other in 8 months, and a mediator who looked like she needed a vacation. I'm not a therapist, I told them at the start, but I have spent 4 decades in a business where the land outlasts everyone's feelings, and eventually the question of what the land does has to take priority over the question of who was right. We spent 6 hours working through the structure. By the time I drove home, they had a framework. Not peace exactly, but a functional path forward. The land was going to be managed properly. That was the part that mattered. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a while before going inside. The problem with being good at seeing other people's situations clearly is that you can't pretend you don't see your own. My son and I had built something together. Not equally. I built most of it before he arrived, but he had given years of real work to it. What went wrong wasn't his work ethic. It was that somewhere in the last few years, the decisions stopped being his and started being hers, and he either didn't notice or decided not to say so. I don't think he meant to push me out without warning. I think he got pushed himself and couldn't find a way to tell me. He came by the property on a Saturday in April. He didn't call first, which is something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. He parked by the old equipment barn and walked out toward the back section. I watched him from the window for a moment, then put on my jacket and followed. He was standing near the bench when I got there. He didn't turn around until I was close. He said, "I should have talked to you first." I said, "Yes." He said he hadn't handled it well. I said that was true also. He looked at the creek for a while. The water was high from a wet spring moving fast over the flat rocks. Good year for the watershed. The trees along the bank were just starting to show color again. He said his wife had meant well, that she'd been worried about what happened to families that waited too long to plan. I said I understood that. I also said that meaning well and handling it well are not the same thing, and that I had noticed she'd been the one driving the timeline. He didn't argue with that. He asked what I was planning to do with the 60-acre parcel. I said I hadn't fully decided, but I told them I'd be willing to discuss a long-term lease agreement that would give Callaway Ridge access to the back section in exchange for a percentage of the timber yield. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's a real offer?" I said it was. He asked why. I said, "Because you're my son, and the land deserves to be managed well, and those 2 things aren't in conflict." We walked back to the barn without saying much else. He got in his truck and sat there for a minute before starting it. Then he rolled down the window. He said, "I didn't know you'd restructured the land trust." I said, "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that. Because the moment I had to tell you, it meant I didn't trust the situation, and I didn't want to be the one who said that first. He nodded once. He didn't look happy exactly, but he looked like a man who had heard something true and was going to sit with it. He drove out. I stood there in the driveway for a while. By summer, Ridge Reserve Consulting had 4 active clients and more incoming inquiries than I could take on alone. I brought on a young woman named Priscilla, a forestry and land management graduate from NC State, who had applied to Callaway Ridge 2 years ago and hadn't been hired. I'd remembered her resume. She was sharp, methodical, and she didn't pretend to know things she didn't know, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. She asked me in her first week how I'd gotten the Knoxville contract so quickly. I told her 35 years of showing up, learning the work, and not burning bridges even when people gave me reasons to. She wrote that down. I didn't ask her to. The lease agreement with Callaway Ridge was signed in August. Standard terms, fairly negotiated, both sides represented by counsel. My son and I met at Hugh's office to finalize it. His wife was not there. Whether that was her choice or his, I didn't ask. We shook hands when it was done. A different kind of handshake than the one at the closing table. We both knew it. He said, "Priscilla is good." I said, "I know." He said he wished he'd hired her. I said, "I know that too." He almost smiled at that. By fall, Callaway Ridge and Ridge Reserve were operating in parallel, not as competitors, not as a merged entity, but as 2 separate organizations with overlapping interest and a formal agreement that said so in plain language. It wasn't the succession story his wife had planned. It wasn't the retirement I had not planned. It was something else, something that didn't have a clean name but worked. I drove out to the back section one evening in October, just before the light went. The hardwoods in turn, the way they do in that particular hollow, slower than the ridge trees, so they're always about a week behind in the fall. My wife used to say that was her favorite week of the year. I sat on the bench. 35 years. One company, one family, one piece of ground that I had learned as well as I had ever learned anything. And then a handshake and a signed page and a morning where I had to decide whether the thing I'd built was going to outlast the moment or disappear into it. It outlasted it, not because I was clever. I know men far cleverer than me who lost everything to a bad season or a worse partner. It outlasted it because 30 years before anyone thought to push me out, I had decided that the most important thing I could hold on to in this business was not a title or an office or a line on an org chart. It was knowledge, relationships, the kind of credibility that doesn't transfer when you sign your name on a document. You can sign away a company. You cannot sign away what you know how to do. My son is a good operator. He'll grow the business. His wife will probably be fine once she understands that legacy isn't something you extract. It's something you tend. They'll learn that. The land has a way of teaching it. As for me, I am 63 years old and I am not retired. I have a consulting business, a land trust, a 60-acre parcel with creek access, and a desk I chose myself. I have a young associate who writes things down when she hears them and will be running something of her own inside of 10 years. I have a son I can still call on a Sunday. That morning at the closing table, he shook my hand and I thought it was an ending. I was wrong. It was just a transfer. The part that was always mine, I kept. I've been thinking about what I would tell a younger version of myself if I could go back to that closing table. Not to stop the signing. I wouldn't change that. But maybe to say, pay attention to what you actually own, not just what has your name on the letterhead. What happened between my son and me didn't start with malice. That's the part I had to sit with the longest. There was no villain in that room. There was a young man who had worked hard, a woman who was afraid of what happens to families that wait too long, and an old man, me, who would assume that 35 years of showing up would speak for itself. It doesn't always. That's not cynicism. It's just how things work when people are scared and moving fast and nobody stops to say the hard thing out loud. I built Callaway Ridge the way most men of my generation built things. Quietly, steadily, without much ceremony. You get up, you do the work, you solve the problem in front of you, and you assume the people around you are watching and learning. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're watching something else entirely. What I learned, not from this situation alone, but from 40 years of dealing with land and timber and families who couldn't agree on what to do with either, is that the most durable thing you can build is not a company, It's a set of relationships and capabilities that don't depend on any single structure to survive. The company can be transferred. The knowledge doesn't transfer unless you hand it over deliberately. I hadn't handed mine over. That turned out to matter. There's a version of this story where I leave bitter, where I spend the winter stewing about the handshake and the timeline document and the attorneys from Charlotte who called Hugh without telling me. I understand that version. I felt some of it, but bitterness has a way of making you stupid. It narrows your focus right when you need to be looking wide. And at 63, I couldn't afford to be stupid. The land doesn't care about your feelings. The clients don't either. Priscilla asked me once what kept me from walking away entirely, just retiring for real. Taking the money from the sale and sitting down. I told her I'm not built that way, and more importantly, the work I do is genuinely useful. The families I help would make worse decisions without someone who has seen this particular set of problems before. Walking away from that because my feelings got hurt would be a waste. Not of my potential. I don't think in those terms anymore, but of something real and practical that took decades to accumulate. That's the thing about getting older, that nobody tells you clearly enough. The work you've done doesn't disappear when someone takes the title away. It's in you. It comes with you when you pick up your coffee cup and walk out the door. The question is just whether you have the steadiness to recognize that in the moment, when everything is loud and the instinct is to either fight or collapse. I picked up the cup. I walked out. And then I got back to work. That's all it was, really. Not strategy. Not revenge. Just a man who knew what he knew and decided that was enough to start with.